Welcome to Utica Tuesday number 261 today with Frank Barkow. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Enrique, for inviting him. Just a couple of quick words about the organization of tonight. After the lecture, we will have time for questions. So these are normally started by our students from the first year. And then afterwards, everybody is allowed to ask questions. So just raise your hand and then we will give you the microphone. Of course, you can also ask questions online, be it in the Telegram channel or in the YouTube live chat. And with that, I will just give the word to Enrique, who will do a short introduction of our guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Helene. Thank you, everybody, for being here, but especially thank you to Frank Barkow for accepting the invitation to come here to talk to you, to us today. Yeah, you all know Frank Barkow. He's a founding partner of Barkow Leibinger, one of the most well-known and recognized offices here in Germany and everywhere because they are internationally working. And actually, Frank Barkow is an American architect, born in the US and American, though I think you represent both situations because by birth you're American, but by residence and long time living, you're from Berlin. Yeah. So I think it's a pleasure to have him here because his work, the work of Barkow Leibinger, has been very well recognized and very influential in the way one can understand that an architecture practice can be complex, can be confronting many different scales and different programs and different types that go from the office or industrial buildings or cultural buildings to smaller scale interventions that have to do with exhibitions and with other type of approaching to architecture. That gives you a very broad way of understanding architecture that I think in a school like this is quite important for all of us, all the students. Actually, their work has been named in many prizes and awards, and it's represented in so many places that I know from Biennales, from Venice, from the MoMA in New York, and many others. But I think it's important to also commend the constant connection of Frank Barkow to teaching and to education. And mostly, as far as I know, it has been in international universities, not necessarily here in Berlin, but mostly in Harvard, where he was studying also in the early years where the chairman was Rafael Moneo. We were talking about that. But he has been teaching and teaches usually in the States, in Harvard, or in London, in the Architectural Association, as you mentioned briefly before. So I think we are going to listen with great attention to his presentation today, and knowing that the interest of their work has been in many cases clearly linking what I see here, sticks and stones, linking materials, technology, handcraft into the pursuit of an excellence in architecture that I think they represent very well. Thank you very much.
It was great to see the studio work today. So to see what you guys are doing, which a lot of this is overlapping with what we're doing in the practice. So and thanks for coming. I guess it's the last day of the semester, I heard. So thank you for being here in real life and virtually. That's terrific. And there's some people from the office too. Glad to see your faces here also. Can I advance this thing? Sorry. So okay. This starts sort of biographically, as Enrique was saying. I'm not from here. I'm from Montana, from the Rocky Mountains, which I gave a lecture a few weeks ago, which was much more biographical, but somehow this formulated how I would work in a place like Montana, which is the size of Germany with about 800,000 people. architecture there were a few historical examples like Cass Gilbert or this amazing landscape. So the drawings on the right from Violette Leduc of Mont Blanc was an idea about landscape as a kind of architectural form. The first schools I went to were factories like this in Helena, Montana, the Archie Bray, which was a ceramic and brick foundry. And some of the first sort of teachers were people like Peter Volkas or their work who taught at Black Mountain in ceramics, but all of a sudden started to use ceramics in a very, very different way than, say, a potter using ceramics as a kind of installation or kind of environment. But this idea of the physicality of working directly with materials was essential for us and how we work today. I didn't begin as an architect, but as a carpenter, in Germany you say a Zimmermann, framing houses throughout the Rocky Mountains, but began to sort of understand the relationship between, say, construction drawings and physically building, and particularly in timber in the Rocky Mountains. I started school in Bozeman, Montana, which was a kind of cow town of 30,000 people with the largest timber clear span structure in the world in 1957 at the time of this, and was an architect, but also grew up there doing things like skateboarding or listening to punk music. But so it was really a kind of inclusive education of architecture, landscape, but other sort of impulses of what we're doing. So in a place as isolated as Montana, one of the things that I began to observe was industrial engineering projects that were in a way the most profound and visible structures in my sort of backyard or in the environment that I grew up in. This was really architecture. And later would find things like quotes from artists Donald Judd about, in fact, and this goes back to history, that goes back to Corbusier, but this idea of these utilitarian or engineering projects in America being profound or an architecture in its own way, in its own right. In 64, Judd's writing about Drexler's show at MoMA in New York, which is featuring structural engineering as a kind of art form in its own right, in a sense, elevating it as a kind of pragmatic and experimental art form in its own right. So some of the things we've been doing and the talk tonight, the slides I've prepared are really about the importance of our practice being an evolving one that's changing, that's responding to, technology for one thing, engineering for another one, social prompts, and how we can act as kind of bricoleurs, or in a way, what are the tools we can use for creating architecture. So that's been a kind of mantra for us. Again, we've been working for like 30 years. So how do you produce work? How does it evolve? How do you archive it? So we started producing our own manuals, not as kind of monographs of architecture, but as manuals, focusing primarily on processes. How do you treat materials? How do you transform them through tools, whether it's digital or using a hammer, and how that could produce a kind of active archive, we would call it, a kind of collective building catalog of techniques and materials that work at different scales. And we started to both catalog this kind of work and exhibit it at the same time. So this is an early 32C show in a Konstantin Gritschik vitrine, or a kind of exhibition case of different works. We started to look at, again, different tools, again, high-tech tools, low-tech tools for looking at, say, how you could produce a space frame, or tools that could cut tubing or metal in a particular way. And in a way, I'm showing you this because this is work that's produced by students. They come into the practice. and produce research work, which again is kind of parallel to our practice work, our building practice, which we're also dedicated to, but how that works. So a couple of years ago, we had a show called Revolutions of Choice at the Haus on Waldsee here in Berlin, which was a COVID show. So, but it had the opportunity of shipping all this material that we had warehoused over the years, just shipping it across town to have a show. So again, I would call this an archival work. These are all the, well, most of the models we produced in the last 20 or 30 years, which we pulled out of storage, put into a warehouse, edited, and then basically just drove it across town. So instead of the difficulty of sending a show to Hong Kong or to New York, we could just simply produce an exhibition in our own backyard in Berlin by uncrating all this material and then showing it. So in a way, it was the kind of, in this kind of COVID vacuum, it was the perfect opportunity to exhibit work which was at the scale of models, but also at the scale of one-to-one installations. For us, I think it's important that what we exhibit, and this also kind of moving away from, say, historical representation like drawings and models to experiential installations, which are spatial, which are physical, that you can move into collecting material that was a wall, a kinetic wall, which we had in the Venice Biennale for Ram Koolhaas's exhibition a few years ago, to a kind of cross-section of models and physical materials. At the same time, and outside of the practice outside of Berlin, began, again, instead of showing a conventional architectural way of exhibiting our work, started to work more and more into a kind of installation scale of work, which are site-specific, such as this loom hyperbolic that I focused on with Gustav Dusing was involved in this project at the Katabia Mosque. Marrakech has no Museum of Modern Art per se, so it was important for us to build in the community, in the city itself, but very much thinking of producing this project in a sense digitally here in Berlin through models and drawing, and then adjusting the project to the building culture of Morocco and Marrakech, building things by hand, bringing materials on site with these donkey carts, working in the souks to produce these steel fasteners and timber from the Atlas Mountains nearby. But, very much thinking of this as an installation, but also as a kind of prototype, which is scalable. This could translate into a factory. It could translate into a piece of architecture somewhere else, but very much using the kind of, I suppose, luxury or opportunity of working in a place like this, which is quite exotic and sort of offsite for us, as a way of experimenting with a kind of architectural scale, which again could be translatable. So this is a temporary installation for 4 or 5 months, but at a later point would inform a project like this Fellows project here, the American Academy in Berlin, which is very much learning using the lessons of hyperbolic surfaces, translating from yarn and timber to steel construction, changing the scale of it, to produce a kind of study pavilion for the scholars at the American Academy, but in a way of showing how, in a way, a kind of process or installation scale as a process could lead to a permanent and rematerialized project such as the pavilion here in Berlin. So those were kind of series of steps or process steps that could lead to a project like this, which is again, permanent. It's rescaled. It's cellular. It's a place for study in a very, very different site, as well as I think an interest in history. This is based on a project from Tony Smith from I believe the early 50s as a kind of structure diagram. It's modular, it's cellular, it can be aggregated and added to other like pieces like this. It talks about a kind of structural efficiency, 3 columns with a kind of cable system holding these together. We took this as a kind of starting point to translate this into a pavilion idea in timber construction with cable fasteners to it. But the idea of projects that I guess historically for us were incomplete or never constructed, and to kind of revisit those as a kind of viable project and with a kind of contemporary interpretation of it. Friado's Oco House, which was an idea for Central Park in New York, was another, fascinating sort of idea about, say, housing or housing with landscape. The Oco House here in the Tiergarten is another important reference, but again, as a kind of incomplete project, which we, in a way, investigated in terms of how do you make enclosure, how do you think of the structure? Can this translate into, say, timber or hybrid construction? So as a kind of exercise of completion or projects that might have existed as a sculptural or have a kind of sculptural identity, how could that be rethought as a kind of architectural, scalable, programmable, sustainable solution? So another one, tensegrity, which is one we've been messing around. And again, like these kind of Buckminster Fuller projects, they always existed as a kind of diagram or as a kind of demonstration, but never really reached a kind of architectural complexity. So we started producing these tensegrity projects. We started again using exhibitions as a kind of chance to install these things in an urban space, to consider them at a more architectural scale. How do you put it together? How do you construct it with local materials and local craftsmen? What are the economics of these things? But again, this is kind of prototypical temporary building to test something which could be, again, scalable, contextuable, but also could translate into something else. So some of the towers we started to produce as models. How can you take a tensegrity tower? Can you make it structural? Can you make it architectural? Can you produce it as a high-rise construction? How does circulation work? And I mean, these are all the things we were talking about this afternoon with the students, but and then bring structural engineers into our practice and say, does this thing work? And it's built in such a physical dimension that you can see how it works. So, and there's the economy of materials in this thing. There's a way of making enclosure with lightweight materials. But again, asking this question, how do you take a kind of sculptural conceit and transform that into an architectural outcome? So even to the kind of ridiculous projects like this, the bubble house, which we produce with recycled plastic Coca-Cola bottles, a skin as a kind of aggregate structure, which has a scale. Just again, as we're all doing these German competitions, and you're very much locked into the kind of rule-based experimentation, it's important for us to have a kind of parallel practice where we can try different ideas about space making or programming that are much more out there. The Serpentine Summer House, which we did a few years ago, again, like Marrakech, I think works very much as a kind of prototype, or like the Tony Smith Pavilion could be something that could be aggregated, could be expanded, producing a temporary summer house next to a historical pavilion in the Kensington Gardens. Modeling, we have a workshop, which is kind of the heart of our practice, which is down the street here. But very much working in model most of the time to produce form. So this is both a model that then translates into construction in Yorkshire, north of London, into bendy ply cladding. Again, trying to work out the economics of it, the kind of the structural idea of this. We're working next to Yona Friedman, so he's very familiar with this kind of technique. So how does this have a kind of structural potential? How does it spatialize? How can you add up to this thing? So again, a temporary summer pavilion, but something that could have an afterlife. It's scalable, it's programmable, you can produce enclosure for it, but using it's portable. We reclad it in a different configuration here at the Haus am Waldsee in Berlin. So these are sort of transient projects or projects that can move around and reconfigure, but again, sort of replacing this idea of exhibition or challenging it in a different way. Casting, this was the entrance that we produced to the Haus am Waldsee exhibition. Very much interested in this idea of bricolage, where the materials for the walls were collected from places like Teufelsberg. So this is representing bricolage of recycled materials from the debris after World War II, combined with infralight or self-insulated concrete as a material that has a kind of historical resonance, but also a kind of again, this idea of recycling in a very different way, combining with, in a sense, a high-tech material like infralight concrete to produce an idea for prefabricated concrete, self-insulated walls, which could be load-bearing, could be an infill material, can be have a texture, can be machine finish, smooth, but I don't know. Again, I think this is also something that I really like about a place like Germany, is that you can become your own expert in terms of technology and producing things. This idea of a kind of Tüftler, where there's production and fabrication partners who will make things for you. These are our guys making the formwork for these pieces, putting the aggregate in, pouring them. And then having these worker guys install the piece at the Haus am Waldsee. So again, even though this is operating at a kind of museum scale, we're really thinking about this as a kind of mock-up, or as a kind of technique that could produce buildings, and of course, I'm down at Madrid talking to Anton Garcia Brillo and people, other friends, colleagues, about these kinds of ways of producing things. But when I came out of school in the States, you would rely on building catalogs to find out how to do things, and here, in a way, you have a chance to in a way produce these techniques or levels of experimentation on your own. So we run workshops in the practice. These were some of our Harvard students who are potters who could produce elements like these, or later different techniques in ceramics. So if you're in an art school, you have access to these kinds of technologies also, which we're always extremely curious about, and also thinking of these things at the scale of 1-to-1, or thinking of techniques like this, which is double form pottery and cut, as the scale of architecture, which could be constructed in masonry. So there's, as these models are indicating on the left and right, are things that have different kinds of value or different use to starting to produce ceramics as cladding materials for our buildings, working for companies, with companies like MBK in Frankfurt, which will produce these things, anything you want. And then going back to our clients, you know, our actual building projects such as the B Hub here in Berlin, which is a kind of horizontal megastructure clad in a ceramic that we produce, or in a sense invented within our own offices here, to other techniques such as bundling, which again has to do with both scripting digital technologies and machines which will rotate and digitally cut scripted plexiglass to bundle into arrays like this. So and again, we don't think of these as objects so much as actual installation environments that you can walk through. It has a scale, it conditions light in a certain way. To the Thicket project, which we produced for this exhibition, How Soon Is Now, which is essentially tessellated 2mm stainless steel rods. There was an idea about drawing these as a kind of space frame, and then using a coat hanger factory to digitally bend these tubes, which we could then in our courtyard bundle together and zip tie together to produce incredibly stable structural elements that we later configured at Princeton with plywood roofs to make a kind of roof structure pavilions where the vertical structure is essentially like a cloud, like completely ephemeral, completely in a way dematerialized through this incredibly thin material, which could produce, I mean, in a way for us, a new kind of architecture through the discovery of bundling in a way, a kind of off-the-shelf material. We tried welding them, it was too complicated, and just zip tied them together. But like these kinds of historical photos, you could stand on the roof of this thing and it was incredibly strong and incredibly stable. To kind of carrying these ideas into other ideas, which again are more programmatic, the idea of, say, housing or even affordable housing in different materially configured towers. And we had figured out about 30 locations within the Karl Marx Allee, where these could fit in between the Plattenbau structures of the Karl Marx Allee. On the right, infralight concrete, in the middle, pine trees or a tree configuration, how that would not work as a kind of surrogate columns, but really as almost like stacked forests of, cheap local Berlin pine, to create spaces with circulation, again, thinking of the economics of producing these things. And as legislation becomes more and more open to timber construction and timber construction as high-rise construction. So, so again, each one of these towers in the presentation and Mark and Sharon's curation of the Chicago Biennale was, how do you make new history, or how do you make history new? So we were very much thinking about different material configurations. This one in some kind of metal, again, a tessellated metal, lightweight metal, to do these things as a kind of proposition about point tower housing that could add density in a city like Berlin. Again, when we arrived in Berlin, 30 years ago, there was a huge interest for us as students, as in things like land art, particularly for me in the American West, and started to find, as young architects, we were, not allowed to work in the center of Berlin, but really working very much in the peripheries. So we discovered these demilitarized sites such as where the biosphere in Potsdam. This was a landscape created by the Soviets to protect their barracks. This was being transformed into a park, a city park. You know, as we were teaching at places like the AA, we're meeting people like Calpran, who's talking about architecture of the oblique, and all of a sudden, you know, we're working in a context where we have a kind of a landscape, again, a kind of artificial military landscape, but that can be a kind of building block or a kind of material for producing landscape. So the diagram for this and this idea of topography was, you know, we're not going to make a crystal palace, but we can actually cut into the ground, we can excavate the ground, and again, very much in our interest at the time of architecture as landscape or landscape as architecture, that we will simulate these kind of mounds or these landscapes to produce a kind of greenhouse or kind of enclosed building within the context. We can cut and fill, we can excavate the ground, and then produce these kind of berms, which then could connect out to the park that Peter Lantz was designing and building. But this, for us, this was a completely different experience and answer in a way to Berlin, rather than thinking about this kind of historical city that in the periphery of the city, we were finding all sorts of really super interesting conditions of damaged sites, of demilitarized sites that could be generative of a very different kind of architecture. So, and producing a kind of architecture also that I would say, you know, was more infrastructural. You know, it wasn't about schöne Details, but really about building a building economically in 1 year in the context of a you know, very strange, almost land art scale landscape. So there was an interest in topography. Rather than typology, topography as being a way of operating and working and generating a very different idea of sort of contextual or site-specific architecture, a building that could transform. It was originally for the German Garden Show, later became kind of event space. It may ultimately become a school. So, but also kind of architectural framework that can transform every 10 or 20 years based on use and utility. A more recent project for opera sets for Fidelio in Vienna, directed by Christoph Waltz, was how could topography reinterpret, say, the Theatro an der Wien, which is a Baroque 18th century theater, to continue the sort of topographical space of the theater into a kind of stage set that would be animated by the singers and actors in this in Beethoven's only opera through these spaces that has apertures, people can move through it. How do you do that? So we never did a piece of architecture that was so choreographed so precisely, where every singer is moving through this either as a group or individually. Again, a timber structure which was prefabricated in Poland in sections. It was brought to Vienna and then built like a ship in a bottle into these spaces. Again, with this idea of a kind of spatial continuity of the cursor works here, yeah, of the historical space through the actual sets of the theater, which is almost, you know, the same size as the seating area of the historical theater itself, into again a highly choreographed, scenographic, musical space where the stage sets themselves are acting as a kind of acoustical amplifier of the sound and the music, and the kind of precision of being able to work into this thing. So again, you know, topography as a kind of approach, but in a very, very different context. And the idea of, I suppose, architecture not as a building or as like an object, but really as a kind of completely a complete continuation of the Baroque space within again a very contemporary idea of the space. So, and then within a third context would be again working in a more urban setting with the office buildings, which is kind of office and residential, affordable market price housing, all into a kind of mixed use building on the site in Kurfürstenstraße, but thinking this also topographically not, doing the typical kind of Berlin basing with the tower, but a kind of radial plan with these extruded and sort of offset volumes to create enough space for both offices and living spaces on a kind of typical Berlin, 70s block of housing. Again, not very far from here, but again, very different kind of context. And then thinking about these pieces as kind of extrusions out of a ground that could be cut with, a rough cut stone cladding for the building. So again, we're always doing these competitions against each. Sometimes you win them, sometimes we win them. Timber, which I've indicated, has become kind of a go-to way of construction. Again, for me as an old carpenter, but also with the idea of quick fabrication, sustainable construction. We had done this campus restaurant, some years ago, using digital technologies in the Black Forest for cutting glue laminated engineered timber, working with Werner Sobeck in Stuttgart, where this was built, looking at both biological hierarchical structures and then transforming that into a kind of hybrid steel and timber structure with a honeycomb roof, where the roof can be programmed. It can be for daylighting or artificial light. Or acoustical into a kind of, again, one-off custom structure for a cantina, which in Germany is a kind of, a restaurant, cafeteria, but thinking about this more open-ended programmatically as a kind of event space or a kind of social place for workers at a factory to meet and exchange, a place of encounter. To a recent building next to it, which is for students or lehrling apprentices to work also, in this case, entirely in timber in a kind of polygon shape adjacent to the cantina, which I just showed you, but sort of continuing a kind of language of forms for this building, which has classrooms and machine rooms and a central auditorium, which has double height spaces, single height spaces, but built as a kind of organic, I suppose, modern Fachwerk idea of Southern German construction. If you thought of the old timber constructions of the 18th or 19th century, and then how you build it. So we put a crane right in the middle of the skylight, and then assemble these prefabricated walls, which are either opaque or could be glazed in a kind of construction sequence, which was almost as fast as this film. I mean, it was really super fast. So they could frame this up within a matter of weeks because of the idea of prefabrication and assembly on a relatively simple site. So that was again a kind of learning process of both how you conceive a project, but also how do you produce it, how do you fabricate it, can you get all these pieces locally, can you install it, what are the economics again of the project, and how do you stage it, how do you phase it, became a really interesting aspect of again a kind of for us a kind of one-off project again, in a high-tech place like Stuttgart, where you can, again, you have fabricators and craftsmen who could put something like this together. So the next lecture will be in a space like that. So Steel was, again, this idea of, I don't know what you call it, cradle to grave or something, but Steel for us is another one of these Mittelstand Southern German companies, and who famously make an amazing chainsaw, which for me growing up in Montana, you know, everybody has to have a chainsaw. That's how you get around. Looking at a historical project like Konrad Wachsmann, his idea of working in space frame technology, but the idea for Steel was to because they have these forests as a kind of crop. We could select certain trees, use their chainsaws, cut the trees down, make super low tech trusses out of their timber to create a space frame for showrooms for their stuff, which they make clothes and boots and chainsaws and stuff like that, next to a 1950s building, their office building, you know, in the middle of nowhere in southern Germany. So again, kind of dumbing down, you know, the more high-tech aspect of, say, Wachsmann's space frame into simple, you know, peeled log construction with, you know, really simple joints where you could just sort of pin them together or nail them together to create a structure like this. So very much a client with a tool that could produce a certain kind of architecture that would really speak for that place and technology. A couple of weeks ago, we did an installation in Austin, Texas, at the architecture school, which I called Texas 2x4 A-frame. Very different than the steel thing, but working with 2x4s, which is the most, the cheapest and the most common construction element in America. A 2x4 by 8 feet costs $3.20. So it's super cheap. When I grew up in Montana, if you had a ski house, it was usually an A-frame like this, which was the cheapest and quickest way to construct a space. But they always stayed kind of this very simple one room chimney, drop down, enclosed space. And our question was, you know, again, with digital technologies, can you take this very, very simple typology and turn it into much more complex structures, programmatically complex, configurable? Can this be housing? Could be configurable housing where you can make it bigger, you can make it smaller, you can put it on a flat site, you can put it on a steep site. And so we built this in the showroom, which is in this gallery in a Paul Crait building on the campus of University of Texas. We got all the pieces. The whole thing cost $5,000, which is extremely cheap for rough construction for housing. They could recycle the project when we were finished. As I said, it was configurable. It was adjustable to site conditions, again, as a kind of idea for a place like Montana, or America, which is, most of the houses are built out of stick frame, 2x4s or 2x6 construction into a kind of configurable sectional water collection, photovoltaic, net zero construction, but at the same time could be structurally and spatially, you know, interesting. So, you know, they don't have 2x4s in Germany, but we got the closest thing. And we built this in our gallery space in the studios, and then translated the sort of know-how. How do you pin these together? How do you prefabricate them? How do you put them together at the studios? So our shop guys and the students, you know, put these things together outside. They put it together inside. They could build the whole structure in a week. So again, it's kind of an exhibition demonstration project. We combine it with Enzo Mari furniture. Enzo was an Italian communist, you know, who's very interested in do-it-yourself. construction. You could build a chair for, like $20 combined with tables and chairs with this structure, which again, this is sort of like row-bow, rough construction, but we had figured out how to do the cladding for it in polycarbonate cladding on the skin for it. We could figure out how it would work someplace that snows a lot or it doesn't snow a lot so much in Texas, but as a kind of demonstration piece, it was up for 6 weeks, but then we could reconfigure it somewhere else on the campus. But a kind of idea about again, for me, a kind of historical prototype, the A-frame house, but just using the logic of triangulation and then expanding it into a much more complex sectional and spatial configuration as a kind of idea. Right now, we have an installation at the Chicago Architecture Biennial. The next one built out of mailing tubes. We built it also as an interior installation in their lobby out of basically recyclable or recycled tubing out of cardboard. We were interested in projects like the Merzbau in Hanover, which was a kind of reconfiguring of a historical interior through collage, through bricolage, but combined with a kind of material which is about recycling and coming out of the COVID, super Amazon mail order era, how you could use this material in a configuration like this. Again, thinking about this as a prototype, this could be taken out of the gallery space and work as a kind of structural and freestanding architecture for very, very little money, made out of a very simple material, which we were simply, binding together or gluing together. Again, in our project space, mocking it up to see if it would work, going to Chicago, and then configuring this. So again, as a kind of spatial, experiential entrance pavilion to the Biennale itself, but using bundles, again, with a kind of structural logic, which is temporary, but could be a kind of permanent idea about structure and enclosure in a very, very different context. So like the 2x4 project, looking at this, again, we're a building practice. So we're being asked by universities to look at real life problems like residential housing for students in mass timber construction, building a kind of residential addition to the Rice campus, which is a historical campus, and a place like America, which is always about 10 years behind Germany in terms of sustainability, technology, engineering. How you could produce affordable, student housing in timber construction. So producing that construction, on a kind of lightweight facade in a kind of split level section, bringing that on site again, during, through COVID and afterwards in a kind of post and beam construction with CLT construction fitting within both a kind of a historical context. Rice is kind of like like an incubator for architecture. They had a classical era, a kind of modernist era, postmodernist era. So kind of inserting this building into a historical campus at the same time introducing to Rice, the first example of mass timber construction on the campus, and finding, trying to figure out how to do that in the States, finding fabricators or producers that could produce these elements and bring them on site to a house that, at the same time doing a house in stick framing for myself in Bozeman, where I'm from, on a 5-acre site, atrium house, which is a kind of unusual typology for Montana for a house in a context which I would call kind of rural, suburban. But even this place had a history of mid-century modernism. There's a Neutra house nearby built out of log construction, but producing a house that could work as a work-live space that's either introverted around a kind of central courtyard or could open up, expand out to views into the countryside or the view to the mountains. So you have this kind of also the idea of the house in this kind of unfolded section that could incrementally, which we could also have done with our 2x4 project, incrementally adjust to the site, the sloping site, in this kind of mountainous region, stick framing, but again, prefabricating, pre-cutting, as many elements as we could to produce this kind of framed in building. It has a rock garden sort of in the center. You can heat it sort of incrementally as you like. If you need more space, you can infill these, like exterior spaces can be infilled later if you need more space. But really the idea of using it as a kind of somehow a house between the kind of typical suburban houses of, say, America and the kind of McMansions, they're also nearby, but a house that could work as, both as a kind of living space and a workspace within this context. So, very much using the kind of typical industry standards for framing, wood walls and glulam timber long spans, but producing it in a very different and I would say more modern way. So I think this is kind of leading to this kind of the timber other projects we've been doing, which have to do with an industrial site where we're adding like I guess in Germany you call it Aufstockung. We were adding onto an existing building. This was a storage facility where we did a timber building, which was built on top of it for an industrial campus as a kind of fitness center, which we could drop on. It's timber, so it's lightweight. As an idea of a kind of Nachverdichtung or a density strategies for adding different kind of programming or mixed use programming on what's typically very homogeneous programming, a kind of industrial site, to looking also at again almost prototypical, looking now in places where we're doing competitions for say office buildings, which now, as in this example for Friedrich and Carl, which is a configuration which could work almost on any site. It's adjustable because of this sort of sliding strategy of a post and beam timber construction with a kind of roof, which can be photovoltaic, as a kind of prototype or say office or housing up to 6 stories in this kind of construction. So I'm kind of bombing you with a lot of projects, but all of these projects are sort of related to each other in terms of an evolution in the practice, how we're thinking projects and rethinking in a way old projects. So 10 years ago, we would have thought about an office building or loft building in Germany in a very, very different way, but based on these kinds of techniques, we're looking at these kinds of approaches. I think, and it's starting, with the beginning of the presentation, going back to structure, ultra structural. I think this is the last chapter in the talk tonight, but how can structure be architecture? So again, working with engineers like Selbeck, who's committed to concrete, but it's bad as a kind of sustainable material, so let's use less of it. So he's doing things like making gradient concrete, where concrete is now, if you cut a section through your arm, don't do it now, but the bone structure is porous, like a sponge. So he's looking at a kind of parametrically variated section of concrete where you're using half as much concrete as you normally would with steel reinforced concrete and testing that. So he's kind of, and again, we're always looking for prompts like this in architecture. Like if an engineer comes up with that, then can we make architecture like this? Like all of a sudden suspending, say, floor plates, which are half as heavy as normal concrete, could produce superstructures where you suspend the floor plates with an idea of lightweight, of building quicker, of using less material. Again, looking for a kind of structural invention that could drive a kind of architectural project. And I was talking about the Kansas City project from Louis Kahn earlier, but the idea of building a superstructure, structure on a kind of truss on the roof, and then dropping the floor plates down below it. So again, a kind of contemporary invention of using concrete in a different way, coupled with a kind of historical project from the 70s for an idea for, say, living and gardens that could be suspended from a lightweight and quickly constructed structure. So, this is stuff we like to do, or again, look at historical places. There's a smart factory outside of Chicago that we finished a couple years. Chicago, again, or, looks like that, like anywhere in America. But, looking at, I guess, like building culture, like in Chicago, they're really good at making steel stuff. So, whereas they could never, they'd be terrible trying to pour concrete, but they can do things like that. So looking at a smart factory, which is a clear span structure for machines in this kind of figure 8 configuration. It's a suburban project, in an abandoned site for AT&T. But looking at, in this case, Barrendale trusses, which we could produce off-site. And again, Barrendale trusses go back to the late 19th century. But now, laser cutting these, laser welding these and producing them to produce these kind of large arrays, which again, also the idea of structure as space, or structure as something you can occupy through these kind of arrays. You can walk through the structure, you can add more programming or more space to the structure. Being a kind of continuous interest of structure, having a kind of, in a way, use value beyond just simply holding roofs up and things like that, particularly these kind of strange periphery sites between, natural wetlands and, say, infrastructure like the Autobahn, which works like this on the last project I think I'm showing tonight. I think I'm on time, but this Trumpf campus in Stuttgart and Ditzingen outside of Stuttgart, which is this entire campus, which is very heterogeneous, but it's gone from a kind of factory campus to, I would say, a more mixed use. Factories in places like Germany, in a way, can grow infinitely along infrastructure like rail lines or autobahns. And Corbusier was looking at projects like this in the 30s and 40s. Building a series of projects, over years, over like a 20-year time span, and now focusing on this project here. You're just seeing the sort of fitness center over here. But the factory is something that doesn't have to grow horizontally and infinitely, but can also, again, start to grow vertically, can become programmatically more diverse, more, maybe like a university campus rather than an industrial campus in terms of change. So the kind of master planning of this, or what we call soft master planning, which is adaptable. It can adapt to new lands or more lands. It can adapt to programmatic changes or needs over, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So So the building, we're looking at right now, 15 is a vertical factory as a way of saving land, of putting machines in a way up in the air. So how do you do that? You have heavy machines, you're mixing it with office spaces, but to kind of come up with a structural idea that which is kind of counterintuitive, right? Factories are usually horizontal. Ford factories from Albert Kahn in the 20s to find a way to go vertical. So in an earlier configuration of the project, we used four off corner circulation towers as columns, which we talked about today and then in the reviews. And then sort of woven into kind of these trusses, which then the truss step is for office spaces, and then spanning over production or kind of factory spaces around it. In a second configuration, to be more economical, we ended up creating a kind of bridge structure over a kind of showroom space over here. So there was an idea of the structure being more economical, saving steel, making it simpler, and then combining the structure with a secondary kind of space frame for the facades of the building, which are, sort of woven together on those over the corners, which cantilever to use the technology in that way to, again, produce a building which is vertical, which is meant to be communicative, both visually and physically, being able to move through structure. So I'm very much showing you work in progress with a project like this, which again, we're very much in the middle of it, and this is very much incomplete, but to show, and I think, also, I think this is the last slide, but, kind of show the work up front, again, what I'm calling kind of experimental or laboratory work, and how that might inform a construction process and the building practice, which we're, still very much dedicated to. So I know it's your last day of school. I'll finish on that note. And thanks again, Enrica, for the invitation. It's always great to be back here.
Thank you so much. If you're ready, we will jump right into the questions.
Okay, I'm ready.
Does that work for you?
Yeah.
Okay, great. There.
How far do I hold this away? Because I don't know. I never did. All right. So I have a question that has to do a little bit with the topic of reflection. It's the end of the semester as well for us. And I think you mentioned reflecting as well. You started your presentation with the archive, went on to further projects that all had a certain connection throughout. When you create these archives, because of course, in a way you look back at them, but my question is, when you, for example, start a new project, do you consciously reflect and take from the previous and decide to take these parts into the new one? Or would you say it's more like naturally, subconsciously, that it's already kind of part of your practice? And adding to that, what do you ask yourself when actually reflecting upon these previous projects?
Yeah, I guess I reflecting, like looking backwards, right?
Yeah, like looking backwards,
Yeah.
like creating the archives or moving on to
Yeah.
new projects.
Yeah.
What's your process really? Do you feel like there's connection, or do you just?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's also it's like a editing or self-editing process, like some of the stuff like doesn't make sense anymore. Some things become obsolete. Also, technologies become obsolete or unaffordable or unsustainable now. So you're constantly, it's constantly evolving. It's constantly going forward. We're always looking for new ways of doing things. Also, building culture is really like building in Korea is very different. And, building in Dallas or Switzerland. So that informs the process. So it's like getting on the ground, like figuring out what can you do and what shouldn't you not do because it doesn't make sense despite globalization. So, and this idea of mining in a way, the archive, I think there's certain things we can bring out of that and reuse. Again, some are obsolete, some are still relevant, some become more relevant. So it's a very kind of dynamic process of picking and choosing, but I don't, again, I hope not. I mean, I don't, we're not signature architects where we do little white square buildings everywhere on the planet, but we're constantly, look, and that's why stuff like engineers with Sobek, I mean, I'm always looking for something new that would force you, whether it's context or technology that would, and this goes back to the 20s, right? That would make you produce an architecture you hadn't thought of before, which I think is the most exciting thing about the practice. So it's this weird process of looking back and looking forward. So like, does that make sense? Can we take that thing out of the archive?
I
And
just, if I can,
yeah,
add one question. Like personally for you yourself, for your own reflection, do you have a certain criteria that you lay to yourself and to your previous works that kind of makes you make that decision? Like, okay, here, this worked, here, this didn't work, here, I can take that further or not.
is there something that makes me do that or
Yeah, if there's any
ambition?
question.
I mean, it's a search. I mean, we're always looking, for something new. And I mean, and this is like a big question, but like how does architecture, evolve? How does it go forward? And what do you need to do that? It seems like we're kind of in this moment now where we're in this kind of late modernism, late modernism, and very much about pluralism. There's no one camp, everybody has their own different position of architecture. Say, when we were talking about Eisenman and the grays and the whites, say 40, 50 years ago. So, I think it's changing, and and that search that I'm talking about is looking for these things that would differentiate our architecture in a way that's not just stylistic, but is more profound, and it's based on reflection, as you say, or observations of a world that's sort of unknown to us right now. So I think that's a kind of passion and ambition in the practice. And sometimes we fail. Sometimes it's business as usual. But I think that's kind of the highlights our own best selves in terms of architects, how we want to work, that it's social, it's programmatic, it's economic, it's engineering, and to bring these things together. So I think that's kind of, trying to answer your question, but I think that's where we
I
try to
wasn't
keep.
expecting one word.
Yeah, yeah. But I think that's where we try to keep heading.
Thank you.
Yeah, you talked a lot about the importance of local materials in your projects, and projects like the entrance and Waldsee and here the project on the old Soviet barrack. I was asking how much interest and you take in, for example, local on the local history of those places, and how you incorporate those in your designs.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think it's both kind of local, materials, but maybe it goes back to this question to us, and maybe to you, like what's context and how do you qualify it? And like, context doesn't have to be just a bunch of historical buildings that you're building next to and you somehow so context for us can be many. It can be material, it can be technology, it can be landscape. It can be a cultural context. So I think again, I don't know, this is, I mean, I really like the idea of a context that's generative, that it'll tell you what to do instead of like, here's my building, dropping it on, but that somehow, again, these different kinds of ideas of context could be an idea for generating an architecture. And I think that's a roundabout way of answering what you mean by what's local, and maybe that's about getting pineapples from Hawaii. And I, that I'm being funny, but what is that? So I think we have a very broad understanding of context and what it is, and and how that can be a generative tool, whether you're working with landscape or a kind of archaeology, of which I think you guys do a lot, also in a very, very interesting way. But how that thing can, and other architects like Caesar are kind of geniuses at this, but how that can, drive an architectural idea and situate it also into something that's profound and real.
So sad.
Thank you first. My question is more like about the relation with the person will using that space, because you change the perception for the person uses. And of course, you cannot have control for the connotation for what you creation, but after you building something, you go and see the person and their relation with that space, or you don't care?
I care.
Okay.
No, I mean, yeah, the idea of, I don't know. I mean, this is a question that came up in the studio today. I mean, what, as an architect, is the architecture a framework? And I think in the beginning of our practice, I remember trying to control every aspect of architecture, details and refinement. And there was a joke like, take the pictures and run, like that the architecture should be maintained in this kind of stasis, right? That it's always the same in the way you conceived it. But the reality is that it's dynamic, it's always changing. And, we're looking at office buildings that become residential, or that biosphere that I showed you will probably go through 3 radical program iterations that have to do with users, or again, how do you live, that architecture in a way. And again, this is an old modernist trope, but the idea that architecture is a framework and the life happens within that. So I think we've embraced that, over time, and that architecture will change, and that it is a framework, and life will go on and life will change, and that the interface between those two things will do that. I mean, I remember a conversation of the Neue National Gallery here, and the idea is a radical piece of architecture, but it was also an idea of anticipating future forms of art and how they would be shown in a building that's challenging. So, I like, I mean, at least as a kind of metaphor, the idea of architecture being a kind of framework or as a kind of infrastructure where users or people there who occupy it will change. So if maybe we're doing stage sets for Fidelio, which is very prescribed, but 99.9% of the world is not. It's changing. Buildings are changing. We're looking at buildings, historical buildings, which can be repurposed or reused or transformed. So I think what you're saying, it's an old discussion, right? But I think the reality is that will become more and more the case, and architecture will be less of a kind of static, fixed, idea of the masterpiece somehow, but something that's more enabling and more transformative.
Hi. Thanks for all these. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks for all these insights, which were pretty interesting. On the one hand, I have recognized like many works or many things take place in the public spaces, and on the other hand,
I have recognized like many different themes such as sustainability or acoustics or many others. And I was wondering if there's like a special motivation behind this, and how important do you think it is to bring all these aspects to public spaces? Like-
Bringing what aspects to public spaces?
Such as acoustics or lighting or whatever things you were talking about. Like, I feel like you really work with public spaces and spaces in between the private ones and the public ones. Doesn't matter if it's like architecture for living or architecture such as installations or galleries or whatever. So yeah, I was wondering if there's a special motivation, and yeah, and especially because the first pictures you were showing from the like kind of your past subculture life from punk and skateboarding, if
Right.
there's maybe a connection to the public spaces you're working with.
All buildings we design should be really good for skateboarding. So that they go like that instead of like that. No, but I think I don't know. I'm kind of trying to figure out what your question is exactly, but it might tie to the last question. It's sort of like public space, private, public. I guess again, when you're doing a building and like acoustical lighting, that I don't know, architecture needs a certain amount of fidelity, if you know what I mean. That it needs to kind of solve all these climatic things and sun shading and acoustics and all of these things. So I think it could still have a certain neutrality to it as a kind of framework that can be used in different ways, but it needs this kind of basic or baseline fidelity, which has to do with all those kind of engineering things. I mean, they're always like, "Oh, how does that work acoustically?" And I'm like, I'm always like, leave me alone, but it's true, how do you make it, I guess, oh yeah, the thing I'm trying to say is like, how do you make the performative stuff, work with the architectural or even aesthetic stuff, and that it's all one in one thing. So there's kind of integration of those things. So I think, and the installation stuff's more sketchy, they don't have roofs all the time, and it's not, there's no lighting, and but I think this aspect of performative and spatial, architectural, even aesthetic, somehow these things are all one thing. And I think that's been kind of the challenge in terms of architecture as a kind of, scientific thing, but at the same time, a formally ambitious one. So that's a big challenge, I think. Like, how do you, integrate concept and technology?
Thank you for taking us for the journey. I saw a lot of the studies and experiment that you do. In which way, before you started, do you have a big picture what the result you want to do at the end, or what you want, or what the purpose from it, and what is how you manage to all of this experiment to finance this and build it at the end. And at the last, I want to say, what about new technology, like, or what do you think about AI experiment? Do you do something like that, or?
AI, I mean, there's a lot of questions within your questions.
I have tons of questions.
Let's all work back. AI, are you guys looking at AI? I think I was like thinking about AI, and to me, AI was like maybe AI could like version like 100 ideas of a kind if you fed in the kind of constraints and all that stuff. And I was talking to Tom Main, he was saying, well, AI means, I can have 10 people in my office and we'll be doing all this stuff. And still as a kind of tool, a kind of production tool, rather than it's going to replace me or this guy here, that again, a kind of tool. So we haven't figured it out, but I'm asking the IT guys in our office all the time, what it does, how can we harness that, and how's this, like if I need a hammer, I use a hammer. If it's AI, I'll use that. So I don't have any prejudice or it's not going to take over the world or something. But then your other question, I think, about predicting a kind of architectural outcome. I think, and this is really archaic in a way, but I really think we give a lot of credence to, like, try to, right? Like what you make will tell you what it needs to be, if that makes sense. Like through the process of constructing, I mean, have trying to avoid a kind of preconception of an architectural outcome. And you could talk to my son to your right there about painting, like, where's that painting going to take you? It's not, it's, I find it very difficult to I try to avoid, imagining an outcome, but actually let the process take you to that outcome, which sounds very, heroic,
work
but.
with group or
Hmm?
all the time with group, or you work alone?
Well, I don't know. We were talking about that today. I mean, these were group projects that we were looking at today, and I was interested in the dynamics of it. I think we do both, sometimes here's the big idea, let's figure out how to do it. Sometimes it's like whoever has the best idea in the room. So I think it's both group work and singular. I we kind of worked away from the heroic single architect doing everything to more collaborative work. But I don't know. I keep saying, like, make choices for us, and we can look at choices, and I don't, and I hate things that are repeated in the office. I want something new. So, but I think I don't know, in the old days it was more hierarchical, top down, and now it's flatter. Like if a student intern comes in and has an idea about computing, then that's the best idea, then we'll do that, So I think it's a bit more democratic, but I still like busting out a few good ideas, So
First, thank you. I realized during your Vortrag lecture, thanks, that you were talking talking about a lot about scale, and I found that very interesting, and also like those models that were built out of like the ceramics.
yeah.
I found that really, really cool. And then I asked myself if like if you think that a bigger scale, because I think you were only talking about like upscaling things.
Yeah.
If you think that, like, of course, like a bigger scale has like automatically a bigger importance because more people can see it,
Well,
and you know what I mean, right?
yeah.
But if
Yeah.
that's natural, or if it's like society, or what do you think about like if not small scale can also have a big importance? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, no, I mean, it's like, I guess I mean, I like scalability, and like maybe, yeah, maybe some things can get smaller, but and maybe it's a question about monumentality. Like we're building a tower out by the airport. It's going to be the tallest building in town, and it'll be monumental, and you'll see it from everywhere.
Yeah, yeah.
I like that, but but
Yeah, but
that's
kind
cool.
of
But I don't. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think what you're suggesting, I don't think it's any more profound than something that could, be a piece of furniture. I don't think it doesn't make it more self-important because it's bigger, but again, and maybe here's a city that had a history of, monumentality, and which was meant to be, impressive and important. So but I don't know. It's a luxury, I think, to work at different scales, and I guess what its effects are. And you're suggesting one effect is monumentality, or it's impressive. But but it's a kind of sleight of hand, a kind of trick, where I can make these ceramic things, but actually that could be a 20-meter building made in bricks, right? So And there's yeah, Fujimoto does this all the time. You know, he'll stack some potato chips and put little people on them. You know, but uh, uh, you know, I find it really fascinating. You know, I'll take some image I like, and I'll put little people in it. You know, like you're like Rem will always say, like put people in there. You know, I don't know what the scale is, but I think it's fascinating. But I don't think it means anything, you know. I think the little thing, it doesn't, it's a tactic, you know, it's a technique for doing things and thinking about scalability. But we're constant, you know, again, spatially, like what is the scale of, I guess, you know, the human body thing again, like what is the relevance of a scale figure in relationship to a building or spaces? So we're constantly measuring that with what we're doing, you know, so. But it's not, it's not like, well, big is better and small is bad. It's just different scale, I don't know, different, you know, scales of adjustment and what happens into, again, all these different contexts that we're looking at. So, but I don't think it means anything. You know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I also had a question on scale, but rather scale on the level of abstraction, because you were showing models, mock-ups, knots, but then also whole entire buildings. And I was wondering, which one do you think is the Entwurf, the model or the building?
The model of the building, which one is the design?
Yeah, design. I mean, I'm not so sure that I like the English word so much. That's why I use Entwurf,
What's
but I
the-
guess, yeah.
What would the
Entwurf.
the
But
Antwerp,
I guess
yeah.
let's take design for sure.
I don't know. We met, and I mean, we always worked in model, and going to with Maneo, you know, graduate school. Maybe you guys were too in Columbia, but we always worked in model, and we always said drawings lie.
Yeah.
So there's kind of as a way of registering an idea, to a building. The model has always remained the most faithful and accurate description of what you're going. You go, you know, when you go to our buildings, and well, it's bigger than I thought, or it's smaller than I thought. But the relationship between those two things are profound, and of course, the one-to-one model or mock-up is something. It's the best, right? And Mies used to do that, right? He used to mock up his buildings out of paper and at a scale of 1-to-1. But you know, it's something like writers, they write, you know, and painters paint, and architects make models and drawings that turn into buildings. So there's this weird gap between representation and the things you build in the world. So, you know, we try to improve that problem, right? That dilemma of this gap between representation and buildings in the real world. So models and mock-ups and working with physical materials are attempt to fix that problem. So that's why we have a workshop. Kind of Werkstatt is where everything starts. And this idea of versioning is something we believe, you know, you can try that one, try that one, try that one. But that was part of, you know, that's how we, you know, that was part of our education, you know.
Would you argue that perhaps with experience, you get better at kind of managing those expectations, meaning you're less surprised when you walk into a space that you designed?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, as the older you get, you know, the better at observing and noticing things, maybe, you know, maybe I'm wrong.
I don't know yet.
But you'll see. But I think so. But I think, I mean, as an example, we did this kaleidoscope facade in Korea. And I had, you know, we were doing renderings, and I just said, you know, these renderings are bullshit, you know? I mean, this thing's never going to look like that. So we made a 1-to-2 mock-up in our courtyard, which is about the same latitude as Seoul, Korea. And we could see exactly how this thing could work, you know, and it was true. I mean, when we built this thing, it performed exactly that way. But and again, it's not your question. We want to control and predict everything that we do in the world, but I think, you know, it's again, models don't lie, mock-ups don't lie, you know, and they respond to atmosphere and light and shadow. And so I think those tools that, you know, we're constantly looking for doing that. So I don't believe in virtual reality and masks and, you know, we work in a very physical way. So, and, you know, as long as we have bodies and, so we try to find things that duplicate that. You know, sometimes there's surprises, nice surprises. Sometimes there's not so nice surprises. But I mean, it's an interesting question, you know, like, you know, like, you know, yeah, yeah. But the model's the design that becomes, you know, the building, you know, how does that stuff on the wall over there turn into buildings, you know? It's a, you know, it's a age-old question, but it's a really interesting one. But we, you know, you want the effects that you want to produce to be manifested in your buildings. You want to see that realized. You want that level of control and that level of precision. I think it's important.
Thank you.
I was asking myself, you talked a lot, or you showed a lot of projects that use kind of traditional ways of manufacturing and adapting to a modern world. And you also showed the project with the lightweight concrete, which is only one as far as I know, but I don't know. Which is more promising for you to use, the using old ways of building and adapting it to a modern world, or really searching for new ways of building and constructing?
I think, I don't know, I think we're very democratic in a way, you know, I mean, again, if we need that digital technology, we use that. If we need a hammer, we use the hammer. So I don't think there's any like prejudice one way or another, or, you know, everything we do is going to be parametric architecture. I don't, again, I said earlier, you know, it's a search in terms of looking for ways of doing this thing, but I don't think there's any, you know, it's, you know, riffing, you know, we're, you know, kind of riffing and looking for things. And again, maybe based on where we're working or place or budget or these things. Like you had a question of how do we, you know, how do we finance research? But, you know, I would say it's a very inclusive process and one that's changing a lot all the time.
I think this might have been a good ending to a wonderful night. Thank you so much for coming and for
thanks.
sharing your
Sure.
work with us and your thoughts. Thank you for coming and asking questions. And this has been it for this semester. So this was the final winter semester lecture. We see you again in the next semester. Until then, you have an extensive archive on YouTube that you can look at. You can also rewatch this lecture for the rest of the semester ferien and then come back for some more models and drawings in the coming semester. So thank you and have a good night.